I'm a huge art fan and museum goer, and even briefly considered specializing in Greek vase painting as a grad student. So it's really an honor to be able to speak to a museum audience and get a chance to view Tampa's wonderful collection of antiquities. I got a private tour right before the lecture. And the weather is certainly an improvement over Madison's right now. My talk this afternoon dovetails with the museum's current exhibit, Identity in the Ancient World, by focusing on one of the most important markers of social and political identity for the ancient Greeks, that of gender. Indeed, the exhibition page shows us a Greek pot with the superhero Heracles on your left, engaged in warfare, not with men, but with women, the mythical Amazons, nomadic and warlike tribe who avoided men and marriage. Although they are dressed as male warriors, their white pigmented skin, a convention of Greek vase painting, signifies that they are women. The binary between male and female, marked by a visual contrast here, is foundational to all Greek ideas about the self and society, best summed up by the poet Simonides' statement, "In the beginning, Zeus made the mind of woman separate." In other words, women were considered other, a different species from men. This talk will examine constructions of gender in literature and art during a specific moment in the ancient world, the first democratic Greek city-state, Athens, a polis which rose to preeminence during the 5th century BCE, known as the classical period. As is well known, the governance, administration, and even the leisure pursuits of the city were largely the province of men. In contrast to today, Athenians had a less capacious definition of citizenship. Although the population of Athens was around 250,000 by the middle of the 5th century, only about 30,000 individuals qualified for citizenship. The rest of the population was made up of free Athenian women, also considered citizens, but in a more restricted sense, foreigners granted permanent residence, called metics, and male and female slaves, who represented possibly about 1/3 of the total inhabitants of the city. Only free adult males, born of an Athenian father and mother, could participate in the governance of Athens, which was conventionally defined as holding public office. Beginning at age 18, boys of the citizen class underwent mandatory military training, defending Athens from foreign threats abroad, such as Persia in the early part of the century, and other city-states like Sparta and its allies by the end. Athenians thrilled to the bold new architectural experiments taking place on the Acropolis, the religious and economic heart of the city, such as the Parthenon and the decorative art that adorned it. And it's reimagined here as much of the rest of Greece in a 19th century painting. And you can see actually an image of the frieze from the interior upstairs, a copy of it. The Athenians witnessed new forms of monumental sculpture that glorified the movements of the male body, whether engaged in battle or athletic competitions. And in the map at left, you can see that the Acropolis is surrounded by many important political sites, the marketplace or agora, the law court of the Areopagus, the space where the deliberative body of the Athenians, the assembly, met, and the theater. With the newly invented art of drama, Athenian men flocked to the theater where they watched plays whose plots were based on traditional myths, if a tragedy, or political satire, if a comedy, all of which were written and enacted entirely by men, but filled with some of the most fascinating and unconventional female characters in the history of Western literature. And at right, you see the theater as it looks today, the remains of the theater, and on the left, you see a very interesting scene of two male actors dressing up as women. They're putting on their little theater boots, and they've got, they're probably chorus members, which was a character in every single Greek play. I'll talk more about them a little bit later. So you can see that this was actually a form of mostly male entertainment. Even Athens' patron deity, Athena, and here she is, holding on left, holding her spear and helmet, and accompanied by her spirit animal, the owl, symbol of wisdom. So even Athena justified this masculinist agenda as the goddess of war and military strategy. She's also the goddess of weaving, but that capacity is rarely foregrounded in Athenian literature. In the Oresteia trilogy, a set of plays about the transition from a clan-based society to the democratic legal system of Athens, the goddess argues that her very unusual birth story, and it's here it's illustrated on the right, a kind of C-section from the head of her father Zeus, performed by the god of craft, Hephaestus. You can barely see him, but on the far left, he's standing, holding his hand up, and he's got an axe, which was the instrument that he used to birth Athena. So she says, because of the story of her birth, there is no mother who gave birth to me, and I commend the male in all respects with all my heart. So she's explaining why she's predisposed to the male. All of this is to say that life in classical Athens was very much a male affair, with women largely confined to the margins, invisible, voiceless, and anonymous, or at least that's what social ideology dictated. As the Athenian statesman Pericles put it, quote, "The great glory of women is to be the least talked about among men," end of quote. In this paper, I hope to complicate this narrative by considering the ways Athenian women interacted with and contributed to the polis, that's the Athenian city-state, and therefore were seen, heard, and even named through their active engagement with Greek religion. There are many challenges involved in reconstructing Athenian religion. First, Greek religion was based on practice rather than belief, and produced no unified work of theology or system of belief. It was marked by a diversity of ritual activities and emphases depending on period and locale, including, by the time of Athens, the worship of foreign gods. The sources, both literary and material, are scattered across a wide array of periods. Some of them are fragmentary and late, many of them are obscure, and in some cases they are completely absent, especially in the case of cults that involved secrecy. Even more daunting is the task of recovering the religious activities of women, given that men served as the primary religious agents both within the polis and household, and also created most of the texts and objects that describe them. Nonetheless, contemporary Athenian literature, particularly tragic and comic plays, are full of allusions to the ritual words and gestures of women. Indeed, several plays structure their plots around ritual actions, and for this reason, some of them are not staged because they're too different from our own culture. Similarly, Attic vase painting offers another rich array of representations of women engaged in ritual. Taken together, these sources illustrate how closely female identity in classical Athens was bound up with religious practice and the profound impact of women's ritual activities, both collective and individual, on maintaining and perpetuating the Athenian city-state. It's hard to overstate the importance of religion in defining Athenian social and political identity at all periods of its history. When we think of public holidays today, whether religious or secular, we envision only a handful of occasions in which individuals have the day off from work, gather with loved ones, and participate in rituals, most of which have nothing to do with religion. In contrast, almost every other day in classical Athens involved a festival or ritual activity, so much so, and I should say a public activity, so much so that they structured the annual calendar of the assembly around them. And this doesn't even count for the private and domestic rituals which occurred with daily frequency. There were also over 2,000 cults in the region of Attica alone, that is the surrounding area around Athens, all of which required ritual observation. Religious activities thus occupied a huge part of the average citizen's mental space and daily routine. Women participated in Athenian state festivals alongside men and celebrated other civic rituals apart from them. They worshiped the same gods and were involved in the same ritual activities. They joined in public choral song and dance in honor of the deities, although increasingly less so as choral activity shifted to the state-sponsored dramatic festival. They walked in civic processions. They offered prayers. They poured libations or liquid offerings. They tended tombs. They made public dedications in sanctuaries, held priesthoods, and possibly even sacrificed. But there are also a few key differences in how they worshiped. For instance, men and women focused on different gods and swore by different deities according to gender. Principal deities for women in Attica included Athena, patron of the polis and goddess of weaving as well as war, Artemis, protector of girls and childbirth, Aphrodite, the embodiment of female sexuality, and a key ingredient of a successful marriage, by which they meant one that produced children and future citizens, and Demeter, goddess of human and agricultural fertility. This religious order reflected the social hierarchy and women's domestic and familial duties as mothers, wives, and managers of the household. Although women could make public dedications in a Greek sanctuary, they did so with less frequency than men, and whereas men continuously worshiped the same ancestral gods during their lifetime, women adopted new ones when they married and joined the ancestral cults of their husbands. Female ritual tasks, because based on their domestic responsibilities, also diverge from those of men. Activities like water carrying, food preparation, feeding, weaving, and washing often occurred in a female ritual context. To give an example, women were exclusively tasked with ritual preparations for weddings, including the bathing and adornment of the bride, the performance of wedding songs, and the carrying of torches in the nocturnal procession that accompanied the girl to her new home. On the small cosmetic jar at left, presumably one that would have been used by women, we can see the bride seated inside her natal home, being prepared for the wedding by other young women. A fragment of a lutrophoros from this museum's collection, used to carry water for the bride's prenuptial ritual bath, depicts the union of bride and groom, while a winged eros, a little Cupid figure, symbol of desire, flutters above carrying a festal wreath. And I think this is the moment of the actual wedding because the bride is portrayed as looking directly at the eyes of the groom, and this would have involved an unveiling, the unveiling part of the ceremony. Finally, another vase from the museum's collection depicts the procession of the wedded pair from the girl's house to the groom's by torchlight. Women's religious activities, both on behalf of the polis and family, enabled their widespread movement throughout the city as they left their homes to participate in processions and festivals, visited shrines, sanctuaries, and cemeteries, suggesting that the prevalent literary images of female seclusion, the idea that they can only stay at home, do not accurately reflect social reality. Women-only festivals further offered opportunities to build and strengthen the social networks of citizen women, to act autonomously, to exercise ritual authority, and perhaps even to challenge or subvert social norms. Since religion was so central to the functioning of the polis, the idea of citizenship for the Athenians involved not only holding public office, which is how Aristotle, the philosopher, defines it, but also sharing in the religious events of the city. As equal participants in the religious governance of the city, women enjoyed a form of what has been called cultic citizenship. So we have to understand that religion was a very important part of the definition of what it meant to be a citizen. And because women participated as much or more as men in these rituals, they were in effect de facto citizens. This privilege distinguished them from other categories of women, such as foreigners and household slaves, as the lawful agents of the polis, despite their limited judicial and political agency. In what's left of my talk, we will see how some of these practices and concepts were reflected in contemporary plays, focusing on female priesthoods, women-only festivals, funerary ritual, and how the empowerment these acts conferred on women could in turn be reimagined as potentially dangerous to the city. So we're going to start with a comic play called Lysistrata by Aristophanes, which was produced in 411 BCE, exactly 20 years after the outbreak of the war with Sparta, and just after Athens had suffered a series of humiliating defeats in their expedition to Sicily. In the play, women from across Greece, and this is important because they're extra political, their identity is not with the polis, it's as women. So these women, led by Lysistrata, band together to stop the war by staging a sex strike. Spoiler alert, it ultimately works. The play uses women's religious activities to structure the plot, and in the process highlights the importance of these rituals for the polis and the ways they invested women with civic and domestic authority. We see this right away in the elderly women who form half the play's chorus. Highly patriotic and deeply religious, they argue that they have the right to speak publicly, which is something women didn't normally do, and give political advice to the male spectators because of their ritual service to the city. Citizens, we will begin to say a few useful words for the city, which makes sense, for it reared me in splendor. When I was 7 years old, I was a ritual weaver for Athena. At the age of 10, I served as corn grinder for Athena's sacred cakes, and then wearing a yellow gown, I played the bear at the rites of Browron, and I, as a beautiful girl, served as a basket bearer wearing a necklace of figs. So what are these activities that these women are describing? You probably haven't heard of any of them. Well, here the older women are detailing their distinguished religious contributions to the city as a kind of cultic resume that begins in childhood. And these positions, by the way, are all ones that are associated with the most elite women in the city, the most elite families. The position of ritual weaver, reserved for Athenian girls between the age of 7 and 11, involved the weaving of the ritual garment, or peplos, of Athena in her capacity as the guardian of the city under the guidance of her priestess, the Athena Polias. The garment was presented to the goddess during the great civic procession of the Pan-Athenaia, that means all the Athenians, possibly depicted in a panel of the frieze that runs around the interior of the Parthenon. And looking at this panel, you'll see two girls on the left looking like they're carrying some kind of pillow or cushioned object on their head, while the priestess of Athena Polias, probably at right, no one really knows what's going on in this frieze, but I'm going with the current theory, their priestess supervises at right, and then two men next to her handle the sacred peplos. While little is known about the office of grain grinders, we have more evidence for female rituals in connection with Artemis of Brauron, a sanctuary near Athens. Each year, girls aged 5 to 10 from the most illustrious Athenian families performed dances for Artemis, and we don't actually know what they did. Women also regularly made dedications of garments and jewelry to Artemis at Brauron, the same Artemis, after childbirth in celebration of a successful labor and delivery. And we know this because we have long inscriptions, catalogs of what things, which, and the names of the women who dedicated them. Many more girls got to serve as basket bearers who led sacrificial processions, the most prestigious of which was the Pan-Athenaia. They carried a special 3-handled offering basket on their heads, and you can see, I hope this is really hard to find the space online. You can see the girl on the left, and she has a funny triangulated object on her head. That's the basket. And what the basket carried were the objects that they used for the sacrifice that the procession was leading up to. So there would be a knife, ribbons, garlands, and grains, the kinds of things that they would need to perform the rituals. This sacred office offered elite Athenian families the opportunity to display the beauty of their freeborn daughters, who otherwise would not be seen by unrelated men, and to indicate their eligibility for marriage to all who viewed her. Just as the religious activities of the chorus, or just as religious activities invest the female chorus with civic authority and public speech, usually reserved for men, so too we can see how ideas about female cultic leadership are represented in the title character Lysistrata. Although Greek comedies had been produced for almost 8 decades prior to the time of this play, Lysistrata is the first to feature a fully developed female protagonist. But she's anomalous in many ways. She operates both in the domestic sphere, encouraging the women of Greece to join in the sex strike, and also navigates the public sphere, brokering the truce between the warring factions of men. Theories about literary and historical prototypes for Lysistrata abound, but the most likely hypothesis is that she is based on the priestess of Athena Polias, the highest ritual office held by a woman in classical Athens. This priesthood was hereditary, controlled by one aristocratic family for hundreds of years, who appointed only their married female members to the office. The priestess enjoyed unparalleled prestige and public visibility. She supervised the civic cult of Athena, enshrined in the Parthenon, and oversaw related female cultic positions. Priestesses like Athena Polias were not subjected to male guardianship, whether father, husband, or other male relative, which meant that they could not act for themselves legally, but had to have somebody else a man represent them in legal matters. Priestesses were exempted from that requirement. They had the authority to uphold religious law and to speak publicly before Athenian political bodies such as the assembly. The priestess of Athena Polias, for instance, is said to have convinced the Athenian citizens to evacuate the city prior to the culminating battle of the Persian Wars. As it happens, a woman named Lysistrata I held the office of Athena Polias around the time of the Lysistrata, as we know from an inscription on the base of her portrait statue, now lost. And this is actually the case with most Athenian portrait statues, that we only have the base and the inscription, not the actual statue. It identifies the image as the daughter of Dreicontides of Bate, who at 88 years old had held the office for 65 years, from 430 to 365 BCE, living to see 4 generations of grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren. She is most likely the prototype for Lysistrata, since their names basically mean the same thing, the one who does away with war. And we know that she lived at the time the play was produced and was quite possibly sitting in the audience, because priestesses were probably the only women who were allowed to go to the theater. It was an all-male audience. Understanding Lys explains her leadership role within the play as religious and the critical importance of women's religious activities for the protection and preservation of the polis. Another play by Aristophanes called Women of the Thesmophoria, also staged in the same year, similarly revolves around women's religious activities, this time an obscure, at least obscure to us, an obscure festival called the Thesmophoria. Since the women who participated in this women-only event were sworn to secrecy, Aristophanes presumably did not know what they actually did at this festival and does not make direct reference to their activities in the play. And yet the play is called The Women of the Thesmophoria. Instead, he uses the festival as a comic opportunity for envisioning the inversion of social hierarchy, as he kind of did in the previous play in Lysistrata, in which a man is brought to trial by a polity of women. Having heard that the celebrants of the Thesmophoria intend to prosecute him for his negative portrayal of women, the tragic poet Euripides, who we're gonna look at one of his plays at the very end of my talk today, he doesn't go himself, he convinces a male relative, to infiltrate the Thesmophoria, where the women have set up their own form of government and where they're going to put Euripides on trial. The kinsman, to pass as a woman, has to be shaved, dressed in women's clothing, and instructed how to talk like a woman. Yes, the Greeks believed the women talked differently than men in ancient Greek society. And what better teacher than a tragic poet skilled in training male actors to impersonate women to do so? Once at the Thesmophoria, the women present the charges. And this doesn't sound like a funny play, probably to you, but it is actually very funny. It's never staged in the modern world, probably because this is it's such an obscure festival to us. So here, one of the women stands up and says, this is what Euripides is doing, and this is why we should not let him get away with this. What kind of abuse has that man not smeared us with? Where is there in all the places where there are actors and choruses and spectators that he has not slandered us, calling us whore wives, man chasers, wine tipplers, betrayers, chatterboxes, sickos, and a great curse to men? He's not the only one that says that, by the way. Well, that's why as soon as our men get home from the theater, they eye us suspiciously and straight away make a search in case we've got a lover hidden in the closet. And we're not able to do anything now the way we used to before, what with the kind of bad habits that man has taught our husbands. He's made it so that if a woman so much as weaves a garland, she's assumed to be in love, and that's not with her husband. In response, the kinsman doesn't attempt to deny the charges, but rather doubles down on them, arguing that the crimes committed by women are in fact far worse than Euripides describes. And then he lays out a whole bunch of different misadventures that they have. So just as the young wives in Lysistrata implausibly bring the war to a halt with a sex strike, so too the idea that women could actually prosecute a man, and a poet at that, is equally preposterous. But it nonetheless reminds us that the Athenian spectators took very seriously women's role in the city, and they believed that the welfare of the polis depended not just on the independent authority of priestesses, but also on the collective ritual engagement of citizen women. So now let's look at what this festival actually involved, and the sources are outside of the play. Women-only festivals from which men were strictly excluded comprised an important part of the Athenian ritual calendar and provided a special occasion not only for worship, but also for female solidarity and leadership. Most of this non-domestic ritual engagement involved fertility rites. Festivals in honor of Demeter channeled the generative power of women to stimulate both agrarian and human productivity. The Thesmophoria, the oldest and most famous of these festivals, was observed in almost every part of Greece, but we have the most evidence for the one that was held at Athens. The Thesmophoria was the largest and perhaps the oldest festival celebrated by Athenian women. As part of the official state religious calendar, by the way, there was no separation of church and state as we would call it today in Athenian politics. So this was part of the religious calendar was the state calendar. So this was a public religious occasion with a special civic space set aside for it, a shrine adjacent to the area where the assembly met. So it's right next to the governing body of men. And this festival was considered so important to the welfare of the city that Athenian men were required by law to pay all expenses for their wives to attend, and all civic business ceased for the duration. It was a 3-day festival. What we know of the rites performed at the Thesmophoria come from a variety of historical sources outside of the play. The 3-day event honored Demeter, goddess of the grain, and her daughter Persephone. They're actually two sides of one thing, really. Persephone, queen of the dead, who together symbolize the phases of the agricultural cycle: sowing, harvest, and the fallow period of winter, which I guess you don't have down here in Florida. The festival began with the sacrifice of piglets during the summer, whose remains were then scattered in pits. So this all sounds very bizarre. During the festival, they were recovered and placed on altars together with cakes fashioned into snakes and phalluses, both of which represented fertility. And these seem to have worked as a kind of like super fertilizer to be mixed with seeds before planting to ensure a successful harvest. The image at left, nobody really knows what's going on here, but one possible interpretation is that this is related to the Thesmophoria. A woman leans forward, she's holding a box to sprinkle something from this box held in her left hand, and on the ground stand 4 phallic-shaped objects with leaves of barley curling around their bases. And perhaps the woman has brought them to the field. These might be the models that were placed on the altars of the Thesmophoria, and perhaps a woman has brought them to the field and planted them among the newly sprouted crops, scattering something over them meant to stimulate their growth, like the sacred decayed mixture produced for the festival. The rest of these celebrations seem to have enacted or recalled the story of Demeter's abduction by Hades, Persephone's abduction by Hades, Demeter's outrage and sorrow, the famine she inflicted on the human race, and the eventual reunion of mother and daughter. So the women seems to have imitated the lamentations of Demeter for her daughter, and then they celebrated the gift of childbirth and children on the 3rd and final day, which in the myth is the reunion, Persephone coming up from the underworld and being reunited with her mother, and that is spring because she's come back from winter. So perhaps he enacted the myth at the celebration. Like other so in celebrating the gift of children and childbirth, they linked the fertility of the earth with the bearing of citizen children. Like the other women-only festivals in ancient Greece, the Thesmophoria established a female culture in which women were ritually and politically in charge, if only temporarily. The celebration emphasized that the continuity of the city-state and its welfare depended upon women's reproductive power, as well as agricultural fertility. So let us now turn from public religion to the domestic sphere and from comedy to tragedy to look at the role of women in funerary ritual. In the abundance of textual and artistic representations of death, predominantly women care for the bodies of the dead, perform ritual lamentations over them, and perpetuate their memory at their tombs. While women's primary religious tasks, that of promoting fertility and of supervising death, may at first seem contradictory, the two were in fact connected in the Greek imagination, for the beginning of life implied its end. The hero Achilles, for instance, will suffer such things, quote, such things as fate wove with the strand of his birth that day his mother bore him, end of quote. What does that mean? It means that the mother, by giving birth, engenders the condition of mortality in her child, since it was believed that the fates spun out the thread of an individual's lifespan at birth. So exactly how long you were going to live was born together with you, with your life. The most compelling example of the importance of women's performance of funerary rituals for the welfare of both the city and the family is Sophocles' Antigone, a tragedy produced around 441. This is before the start of the Peloponnesian War. It stages a conflict between a strong-headed teenage girl, Antigone, and her tyrannical and I would say insecure uncle, Creon, who has just ascended to the Theban throne. Different city, Thebes, not Athens. The crisis revolves around a violation of religious protocol. When Antigone's brothers kill each other in single combat, Creon, the tyrant, decrees that one, Eteocles, as a war hero, will be commemorated with a public burial. The other, Polynices, a traitor who has marched against his own city, will receive no rituals, and his naked corpse will be cast out of the city to become carrion for wild animals. Only Antigone, as one of two surviving female kin, can remedy the situation. But in so doing, she must defy Creon's order and administer the rites herself over the body of her beloved brother. Indeed, she has already done the same for the rest of the Sam family, as she later states. And there's actually a theory that her name means against generations. She's the last of the family line, she and her sister. So while performing these makeshift rituals over his corpse, for the second time, by sprinkling the body with dust and pouring libations over it, she can't actually do the full routine because she's not at home and she's not in a cemetery. So she's caught in the act. Seized and brought to the palace, Antigone is condemned to death. But as Antigone explains, she doesn't mind because she's obeying a higher law than Creon's. It wasn't Zeus who made this proclamation, nor was it Justice, who lives with the gods below, that established such laws among men. Nor did I think you, Creon, your proclamations, strong enough to have power to overrule, mortal as they are, the unwritten and unfailing ordinances of the gods. For these have life, not simply today and yesterday, but forever, and no one knows how long ago they were revealed. And I think what she's talking about here is the idea that that rituals are traditional and you do the same thing the same way every time if you want them to work. And women are often the ones who are teaching these kinds of rituals to the next generation. So I don't know, maybe she's saying that this is not a law of men, but a law that is imparted by women. That's just my interpretation. Her ritual disobedience, however, proves justified in the end. While she has earned exceptional glory for her actions, a rarity among females, Creon, in putting the city above the family and even the gods, loses what he loves most, his wife and son. So let's look a minute at what actually took place when someone died in the Greek household. Female family members were responsible for the prothesis, that's the laying out of the body, which is shown in the funerary plaque at right. There's actually a lot of these representations in Greek art. So you can see the women, they would start, this is later in the process, but the women would first bathe the body, just like you have a bath for weddings, you have a bath for death. They then would dress the body and wrap it in a shroud before placing it on a bier, and that's the scene now. When men are present in such scenes, so they're now going to engage in ritualized mourning. So that's, I'll talk about that in a second. And when men are in these scenes, they don't typically tend to be in them, but when they are, they're at a remove from the corpse. You can kind of see them on the left there. They're black-skinned rather than white-skinned. That is the convention that I mentioned earlier. So the men are going like this, and they're standing away because the body is polluting. So it's okay for the women to be by them, but not the men. And their gestures are a lot more restrained. So it's okay for the women to be really emotional, but not the men. That's what my reading, that's what I get out of this. So they gather around the body and engage in ritualized mourning, singing songs handed down by women over generations. And I think this is kind of a form of oral poetry that originally came from women. So the women, in contrast, and unlike the men, they stand close to the body. That usually the closest female relatives at the head. So this is probably a wife, as I'm guessing in this scene. And their mourning is accompanied by physical gestures such as clawing at their bodies, striking their chests and heads, and tearing at their hair. And this is mentioned all the time in Greek tragedy, by the way. We have a lot of literary sources for this, beginning with Homer. And so you might notice, like on the bottom right, I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer here. This figure right here, that's a little child. And it's odd, but you see children in these scenes, and I think this is a girl. There's little bits of white paint on her feet. And she's got the same gesture as some of the women. And I think she's probably the daughter of the lead mourner. And she's being socialized into this ritual from an early age. So we always think this is not something you'd want a child around, but there's actually other depictions of children, and female children in this scene. But you should ask the vase experts on what's actually going on. All right. So women also, and I think this is something that's been underemphasized, women also played a really important role caring for the dead at the tomb, located in funerary complexes outside of the city walls. Visual representations of women engaged in tomb visits frequently decorate a specific kind of vase. It's got a white background, and these are called lekithoi. There's some upstairs. Actually, almost everything I'm talking about you can see illustrated upstairs, so that's a hint to go see it. So these were oil flasks that were used for carrying oil to the tomb, where they were poured as libations on the grave. The idea was that the dead would know that they had been there and that they had been remembered. Privately purchased, these vessels were placed around the bier at home during the prothesis, buried with the body, or placed on the grave. Although both male and female members tended to their loved ones' tombs, the lekithoi more frequently feature women in this context. In the example at left, a lovely vase owned by the Chesa Museum of Art at the University of Wisconsin. 2 women prepare to visit the graves of their loved ones, carrying flat baskets with funerary offerings, wool ribbons, and small lekithoi. I don't know if you can see them. They're peeping up over the basket. So the vase depicts the vase, right? The lekithoi has a lekithoi on it because it's used for funerary purposes, and this is what they're doing, is bringing these lekithoi to the tomb. And then the middle one, you can see that the woman on the left is tying these ribbons around the gravestone. And I thought that she was just an overachiever and just making sure that this person was really well taken care of by getting a lot of ribbons, but someone else has theorized that maybe there were this is maybe a mass grave, multiple bodies in one place, so different individuals are being commemorated with these ribbons. And then when you see on the right, that these vases have been left on the gravestone, on the stele it's called, as offerings to the dead. These objects affirmed that the dead had not been forgotten and promised that the women of the family would continue to take proper care long after their deaths. Conversely, the neglect of the grave diminished the status of the deceased and served as a particular reproach to the female kin. And we have some lekithoi which show us broken lekithoi at the grave, like they're not being properly tended. Through the performance of proper funerary rites at home and at the grave, Athenian women helped to construct and maintain familial and male identity. And the circulation of lekithoi provides concrete evidence of women's physical presence in the city as they chose the grave's gifts and transported them from the interior of the house to beyond the city's walls, where the cemeteries were located. They further attest to the critical function of women in performing and maintaining Athenian religious networks, both at home and within the city, whether as basket bearers, priestesses, festival celebrants, or mourners. Ritual activities not only invested Athenian women with familial and civic authority, they also strengthened the family and community, as well as reinforced social ideology. So what I'm going to do now is turn to one last group of female religious worshipers. And these do the opposite. Instead of reinforcing social ideology, they actually subvert it. So I'm going to turn now to a contrasting form of female religious activity that loomed large in the Athenian imagination, one unregulated by the city-state that had the power to subvert the gender hierarchy, dissolve the bonds between family members, and ultimately destroy the community. These are the Maenads, the women inspired to ritual frenzy by Dionysus. Maenads appear frequently in Attic vases where they hold long fennel stalks, wear snakes in their hair, don fawn or panther skins, and carry small animals. I call her our textbook Maenad, as she shows on the left. And you actually can see a lot of depictions of these upstairs if you're interested. The presence of wine cups and musical instruments such as castanets and drums, together with wild gestures, indicate that they are possessed by the god. A vase from the museum's collection at right shows, and this is a lovely vase, you should see it if you haven't already. It shows a more sedate version of these revels, possibly evoking the rites of citizen wives rather than Maenads. They don't really look very Maenadic. They don't have wild animals with them. They're not gyrating, and their hair is not unbound. It's closely tied up. Our fullest, you may know this, but our fullest and most frightening account of Maenadic religion comes from the Bacchae by Euripides, the tragic poet that appears in the comedy I just discussed, and one of the last canonical tragedies to be performed at Athens. The plot revolves around the female worship of Dionysus, which also takes two forms in the world of the play. The mythical Maenads, who accompanied the god from Asia and formed the play's chorus, and the citizen women who, inspired by the god, abandoned their homes for the mountains. Accompanied by his entourage of Maenads, Dionysus returns to Thebes, the city of his birth, to punish his cousin, King Pentheus, for rejecting his worship, using the Theban women, indeed his own mother, as the agent of his destruction. He proceeds to drive the city's women mad, compelling them to flee to the mountains, where they join in secret women-only rites, much as we saw in the Thesmophoria. This is a secret women-only occasion. But here their worship takes the form of tearing apart wild animals, snake handling, eating raw meat, and an eventual skirmish with neighboring men. Promising Pentheus a forbidden glimpse of the women's seemingly lascivious activities, Dionysus forces him to disguise himself like a woman. Dionysus forces Pentheus to disguise himself like a woman, much like the kinsman in Aristophanes' play discussed earlier. And he then lures him to the mountains, whereupon his mother Agave and her sisters, overtaken by divine madness, seize him and tear him from limb to limb. There's a quote, something like they basically played ball with his head. They do this because they believe he's a wild animal. They're so out of their mind, driven mad by Dionysus. The violent portrayal of Maenadism in Euripides' Bacchae is unique and unparalleled among representations of women's ritual activities, even the Maenads that we see on vases. But the fact, although ordinary Athenian women did not participate in such transgressive acts, the fact that they could be plausibly imagined to worship this way underscores the latent power of their religious authority and its potential to disrupt and destroy the male community if not held in check. And that is all I got. Thank you.